Hello, my name's John Ennis, curator producer at Journeys in Design, and welcome to the Boat Shed, aka my living room, as we continue our maiden voyage of Salvage Scotland 2020. Journeys in Design holds dear the notion that we all stand taller in the world when we reach out to countries and cultures other than our own. So I'm absolutely delighted to be reaching across the north of the Irish Sea and welcoming on board Bruce Clark. Bruce.
John, very good to be with you.
Hi there. So Bruce is too modest to let me ask him to speak for himself. So 40 years of foreign correspondent, postings around the world, author of cultural histories, including Greece and Turkey and Russia, and a historian in particular of the early Christian tradition in the United Kingdom. Bruce, I'm in Edinburgh, and you're to be found in different parts of the world, but we're speaking to you today from
Rostrevor on the east coast of Ireland, yes.
Of Ireland, and close to where your journey started as a boy, if you like. Would you like to trace your journey a little bit for us? I give a brief hint of your postings.
Well, I could say in a very literal sense that my journey started here in Rostrevor. It so happens that my parents were married in Rostrevor, so I can literally trace my roots to this small town. But I was brought up in Mid-Ulster in South Derry, in a part of the world where my forebears have lived for about 9 generations. That's quite deep inland, but my father, for some reason, had a great passion for the sea. And so, willy-nilly, I was very much influenced by his interest in the sea. I didn't share his competence as a seafarer and navigator, but I did to some extent inherit his interest in seafaring history.
Wonderful. And you went off then you were schooled and then went off after that away from Middle.
Indeed, that's right. Yes, after university, I joined Reuters news agency, and they posted me first to France and then to Greece. So I spent 8 years altogether with Reuters, and then I had postings in Moscow with the Times, just when communism was falling, and then in Washington later on with the Financial Times. So I've been around the world quite a bit, quite far from South Derry.
Wonderful. You certainly have had quite a journey. And sailing in the sea, I guess I'm thinking, of course, of Greece as being an important part of that culture that you've become aware of. But it's been in the blood from early days. And you do mention your late father and the many journeys you'd have taken, I guess, as a child on board. And we're thinking particularly today of the sailing traditions between Northern Ireland and Scotland. But your late father, was something of a pioneer, really, in sailing in Ireland. Would you like to tell us a little bit?
That's right. Yes. I mean, he began work, in his 20s in the family business, which was quite deep inland in Mid-Ulster. But he always felt this intense desire to escape, to be out on the sea in a small boat that he was sailing himself. And so, really, from the mid-50s onwards, he was plying the waters of the west of Ireland, first of all. He was almost the first cruising sailor to really intensively explore those.
Bruce, you'll give me 2 ticks. Just 2 ticks have been interrupted.
Okay.
We're good. We're back again. So you're on the coast, or your father, right, is exploring the coast, and in many ways, I think, as we've discussed before, meeting communities that wouldn't have been used to such visitors.
Very much indeed, and forming bonds, across huge barriers of language, and, if you like, religion and class, but nonetheless based on a common understanding of the sea, a common love of the sea, a common understanding of tides and waves and currents and all the things that seafarers have to know about. So really, for example, on Tory Island, he established very strong personal bonds with the fisher folk and indeed the amateur artists of Tory Island, That's part of cultural history in Donegal.
Very strong, yes.
Indeed, yes,
Listen,
yes,
I'm
yes.
going to ask if you could tip your screen a little bit up. We're not brilliant. Just
Yes.
thanks. Just I have a tendency to disappear myself from the screen and want you to pop off there. So this really quite an intense family engagement via your father with the sea, and I think in particular there are two voyages of quite major significance to the culture shared between Scotland and Northern Ireland. And can we talk a little bit about an extraordinary journey and craft from 1991?
That's right. This was a very, very great passion of my father. What he did was to recreate the kind of wooden galley that would have plied the Irish and Scottish waters in medieval times. What he was really doing was re-entering the world of the Lordship of the Isles, which was a kind of Gaelic Nordic kingdom whose epicenter was, roughly speaking, the island of Islay, but which extended right across the Western Isles of Scotland. And the most outstanding personality in that world was the great seafaring warrior Somerled. And my father had a great empathy with Somerled and generally with that whole medieval world of trading and sometimes fighting across the seas. And
this was
as a kind of retirement project, yeah.
And this was an actual a galley.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, yes.
That he actually had constructed with his team.
Yes, he raised the money and he had the galley built in a boatyard in Donegal, in Merville in Donegal. It was one of the great, great moments of his life, really. His partners in the project were the MacDonald clan of Scotland and indeed the worldwide MacDonald clan. So he put together quite a coalition of seafaring types in Ireland and Scotland and also MacDonalds from all over the world. And between them, they built this boat and they did a kind of magnificent demonstration voyage from Mayo to up as far as Skye in that summer of '91.
Extraordinary. So from the west of Ireland right across, and that recreating that entity, which was the almost a nation.
Yes, yes.
Amazing. And then the one that this amazing journey that you and I are thinking more about in as well is this journey in 1963 involving a currach traveling from the north of Ireland across to Scotland. I'd like to just say how grateful I am to you for allowing us to include the original film of that 1963 voyage. I'll ask you to say something a little bit about the actual voyage in a moment, but it's a very endearing film from the time, quite a period piece in one sense. But I really would encourage folk to have a look at that piece of footage. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the origins of that particular project in 1963?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I mean this is really one of the high points in my father's life. He was a young man still, in his 30s, and he was putting to very good use some of the knowledge that he had acquired through his voyages around the west coast of Ireland of boat building and boatmanship generally among the coastal dwellers and fisherfolk of that part of the world. They were still at that time using the currach as a working vessel.
So we should just jump in. Yeah, right. And we should just jump in and say the currach, the second oldest boat form in the world, I guess, after a dugout trunk canoe. Traditionally, a wooden lattice frame covered in an animal hide, but with variations. And interestingly, the shape of a currach, it's a sort of generic term, and the shape would be determined by its use and often the river. And it's become known, the different boat shapes have become known according to the river in which they were used. But he was constructing something quite different.
Well, much bigger than the kind of currach, but the same principle, but it's on a bigger scale. And the purpose was to reconstruct the voyage of St Columba, St Columba from Derry to Iona, which traditionally took place in the year 563. So it was the 1400th anniversary of that voyage.
And something of quite intense significance for the two regions, for the north of Ireland and for Scotland, in terms of what then rolled out in early Christian history.
Indeed, yes. The monastery founded by St Columba on the island of Iona became one of the most important centers of Christendom, of writing, of learning, of Latin education in Western Europe, you might say. I mean, this was the so-called Dark Ages. It was a time when places further south in the British Isles were being struck by wave after wave of plague, and that went on for a couple of centuries. And so the community on Iona was one of the few places that was not touched by plague, and that's very significant.
Yes.
And it's from Iona that the Christian tradition and the educational tradition spread downwards to Northumbria and stimulated the Northumbrian Renaissance, the world of the Lindisfarne Bible, St Cuthbert, and so on. So you can hardly overstate the importance of the Columban monastery in that phase of the history of the British Isles.
So, I mean, an extraordinary 1400 anniversary to be celebrating, and the way that it was celebrated really quite magnificent in many respects. Again, your father has managed to galvanize the great and the good to contribute to that that experience. Can you tell us a little bit about that background side of it?
Yes, it was a nice thing about it was that it brought together the great and the good, as you say, but also quite humble folk. And it was an establishment project in certain respects. It was very much backed at the highest level by the Anglican Church.
The Oarsman was the highest, indeed, in the sense that it was met on Iona by the then Archbishop of Canterbury.
Absolutely, indeed, yes. And back on the Irish end of things, it was very much an Anglican venture. It started with a service in St Columba's Cathedral in Derry, and the oarsmen were, as far as I know, all of Anglican background, some future clergy and bishops among them. So it was intensely Anglican in its ethos and orientation. And these days, you wouldn't be able to do something so exclusively concentrated on one denomination. You'd have to do it in a more pan-Christian or ecumenical spirit. But in those days, people were not so sensitive to these things. And it was... but at the same time, yes, it had its establishment background, but the experience of being out on a choppy open sea for 5 days is one that really destroys all establishments. Yes, absolutely.
All that will drop away in terms of surviving. And I guess, I think they had a support vessel as well, but it was a significant sailing achievement.
It was, absolutely. And some very fine judgments had to be made as to where to spend the night and what route to take, whether to go east of Islay or west. All kinds of judgments had to be made to achieve the desired result of rowing, as it appeared, effortlessly into Iona on the appointed day.
Fantastic, fantastic. And you've been gracious enough to let us take the cue of 1963 and not fast forward, but forward to 2023, the 60th anniversary of that, for our own project, the Currach Project, which we're developing. And in Scotland, the Currach is best known on the Spey River, and Scotland's fastest flowing river. Loggers would take rafts of logs on up, or downriver, I should say, and they would be in Currach manipulating this journey up, light enough that they could throw on their backs and walk back down the river and get some more logs. So it was a never-ending task. But we're developing a project with Dan Cottam at the Grantown and Spey Museum, with the help of Raymond and the Coracle Society, who have a coracle shed at the Highland Folk Museum, and indeed with Martin Hughes, who has a wonderful community boat building project based in the grounds of the Scottish Maritime Museum, where we have been also engaging in this Salvage Scotland voyage. So thank you for the allowing us a contemporary reflection on this 60th and preceding voyage that your father had undertaken. But of course, it's all about the maritime tradition, and it goes even further back through to times which are unrecorded by history, and you have obviously had some knowledge of that as well.
Yes, indeed. I think it's important to stress that the maritime links between the northeast of Ireland and Argyllshire, let's say, I mean, go way, way beyond even the Christian era. If you're located on the northeast of Ireland, then your most natural stomping ground, the place where you most naturally head in a boat, once you master the currents and once you work out the tides, is the adjacent part of Scotland. It's much easier to get to than other places in the then densely forested landscape of Ireland. And that's just simply a geographical fact. And in modern times as well, there have been some maritime links that have unfortunately weakened a bit. So in living memory, I mean, many fishing boats and other small boats would travel from Islay to North Antrim for the Old Lammas Fair. And this isn't exactly recreational travel. It's sort of because the islanders would have had their practical reasons for attending the Old Lammas Fair.
Trade.
Trade, exactly. Yes, I mean, people on Islay thought of North Antrim as the next door parish, if you like. And look, it can be a choppy stretch of water if you get the tides wrong. But if you know when to go and how to judge the swell and the tides and the currents, then it's perfectly manageable. My father and late brother once actually rowed from the northeast of Ireland to the Mull of Kintyre in an open rowing boat, for the day. Just, and
as you do.
And they rowed back and they rowed out in the morning and rowed back in the afternoon, and it was and they sent a postcard just to prove they'd been there.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, it's
fantastic.
Yeah.
Bruce, thank you so much for sharing it and giving us a real flavour of those links, historical and more recent. It's been a very great pleasure to speak with you, and I look forward to further conversations.
Well, indeed. Thank you so much.